and thanks for joining us for the American Kinesiology Association's webinar entitled The Evolution of Physical Activity Guidelines in the United States with Dr. Russ Pate, Department of Exercise Science, University of South Carolina, conducting the seminar. My name is Tom Templin from Purdue University, and I am the chair of the Communications Committee of AKA that is responsible for organizing these webinars and the facilitator for today's presentation. The webinar is scheduled for an hour and will be recorded and available for playback. By the end of the day tomorrow, you can expect an email from us containing the link to the recording. The link will also be available on our website under the announcements on the homepage. All microphones and phone lines are muted, so we ask that you communicate with us using the GoToWebinar features. To submit questions, please type your questions in the question box located in the lower right-hand corner of your screen and click Send. We'll collect any questions sent throughout the presentation for us, and he will answer as many as possible during the Q&A segment at the end. Now I'd like to give you some background information on Dr. Pate. Russell R. Pate, a native of upstate New York, was educated at Springfield College and the University of Oregon, where he completed his master's and PhD degree. In 1974, he joined the faculty of the University of South Carolina, where he now serves as professor in the Department of Exercise Science in the Arnold School of Public Health. He has held several administrative positions, including chair of the Department of Exercise Science, Associate Dean for Research within the Arnold School of Public Health, and Vice Provost for Health Sciences. Professor Pate is an exercise physiologist with interests in physical activity and physical fitness in children and the health implications of physical activity. He has published more than 275 scholarly papers and has authored or edited 7 books. His research has been supported by the National Institutes of Health, the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the American Heart Association, and several private foundations and corporations. He heads a research team that currently is supported by 4 grants from the National Institutes of Health and 2 from the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. He coordinated the effort that led to the development of the recommendation on physical activity and public health of the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention and the American College of Sports Medicine. He served on the U.S. Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee, the U.S. Physical Activity Guidelines Advisory Committee, and an Institute of Medicine panel that developed guidelines on prevention of childhood obesity. He currently chairs the coordinating committee for the National Physical Activity Plan. Russ has served in several leadership positions within the American College of Sports Medicine, and in 1993-94 served as the organization's president. He is a past president of the National Coalition on Promoting Physical Activity, and he is an elected fellow in the National Academy of Kinesiology. In 1996, he received the Citation Award from the American College of Sports Medicine, and in 1999, he received the Alliance Scholar Award of the American Alliance for Health, Physical Education, Recreation, and Dance. A lifelong distance runner, Russ competed in 3 U.S. Olympic trial marathons and twice placed among the top 10 finishers in the Boston Marathon. For more than 20 years, he serves as president of the Carolina Marathon Association, which hosted the U.S. Olympic trials, the women's marathon in both 1996 and 2000. I am pleased to turn the webinar to Professor Russell Pate. Thanks so much, Russ.
Well, Tom, thank you very much. I'm very pleased to have been invited to speak with the group today, and particularly pleased to be speaking about a topic that is an important one to me personally, and I'll provide a brief introduction here just by saying that what I intend to do over the next few minutes is more or less in chronological order and and with, I guess, some emphasis on my personal involvement in the issue, overview how I believe the physical activity guidelines that are the prevalent ones in the U.S. right now have evolved over the last several decades, and I think it's been an interesting development, and I think one that very honestly speaks well of the science that people in our field have have pursued over the last several decades. So with that, I'll launch into my presentation. As this audience is well aware, the idea that physical activity is important to health is not new, and there are many examples from the ancient philosophers and physicians that document that even in those days people recognized and appreciated the fact that physical activity provides important health benefits, and I think the fact that Hippocrates and others spoke to this issue, and it's found in their writings, indicates that even a very, very long time ago, authoritative persons were recommending physical activity for its health benefits to the population at large. More recently, in the U.S. And sort of in the middle part of the 20th century, I think the whole issue of recommending physical activity for the purpose of enhancing fitness did gain a fair amount of momentum, and the examples, of course, from that era are many. Bonnie Pruden, who passed away just within the last year or two, of course, was famous for advocating physical activity and fitness, and was a part of the now famous in our field Krauss-Weber studies that resonated with President Eisenhower and prompted him to form the first President's Council on physical fitness in the mid-1950s. Some on the line, at least here, will remember the Royal Canadian Air Force exercise plans for fitness that were widely known and promoted in the early 1960s. And so it's clear that in the post-World War II era, there was an interest in this issue, and there were authoritative organizations that were making recommendations to the public regarding physical activity for health and fitness. Bill Bowerman, who was the track coach at the University of Oregon in the mid-60s, took a trip to New Zealand and was very surprised to find people there that were running for exercise and fitness and health, not common in the U.S. at that time, and came back. He was so impressed he came back and with his personal physician in Eugene, Oregon, wrote a book on jogging, which is sometimes thought to have initiated the running boom for health and fitness in this country. Ken Cooper, of course, known as the father of aerobics, published the first aerobics book in the late 1960s and founded the Cooper Institute in the 1970s, and obviously it clearly has been enormously influential through his career in recommending physical activity for health and fitness outcomes. And if you take a look back at the details of the aerobics point system as it was described in that first book in 1968, which I encourage you to do if you haven't done it, I think you'll be interested to see how comparable those recommendations are to our current physical activity guidelines, and something that happened without the benefit of an enormous body of research evidence to base the guidelines on. Beginning in the mid-1970s, I think the American College of Sports Medicine's guidelines on exercise testing and prescription in a sense, codified the dominant approach to recommending exercise for health and fitness for the population. And it's my interpretation of the history of this that these guidelines, first published in 1975 and then updated on about a 5-year revision cycle ever since, really evolved out of science that was done in the 60s and early 70s in the cardiac rehabilitation arena, where sort of lab-based, structured, supervised exercise was being done and studied. And then people from our field like Mike Pollack and Jack Wilmore and Paul Ribisol and others did a series of studies, controlled exercise studies, that essentially showed that aerobic exercise performed 3 or more days per week for durations of 20 or more minutes and at intensities that correspond to 70% or more of functional capacity, provided benefits in terms of increased maximal aerobic power, VO2 max. And I think it's important to note that that was the dependent variable in most of those studies. Now, before I move away from this slide, I want to draw your attention to the column on the right, which indicates that in that first version of the ACSM guidelines, the recommended intensity of exercise was 70 to 90% of functional capacity. And I'm sure the majority of people listening to this presentation are aware that that is quite vigorous exercise. And it's a reflection, I think, of that's really where an indication of the science that had been done at that point. That's basically what had been studied, and maybe partly to just interpretations that people drew from the evidence that was available at that time. But I would also draw your attention to the fact that in the ensuing issues of the ACSM guidelines, the lower end of that intensity range dropped pretty quickly, from 70 to 50 and ultimately to 40, where it remains today. And I think that's an indication that as the experience and research developed, it became clear that much more moderate intensities of physical activity provided important health and fitness benefits than that intensity that was prescribed in the initial ACSM guidelines book in 1975. So I think that from the early 70s really to the early 90s, a period of about 20 years, our field probably did a remarkably good job of educating the public, at least the elements of the public that we had access to through our educational programs, in what I think is now seen as sort of the traditional exercise prescription, which was 15 or more minutes of probably structured, what is perceived to be vigorous exercise 3 or more days a week. And there's no question that there's a pretty strong exercise physiology basis to that recommendation. I don't think there's any question about whether that works in terms of providing enhanced fitness, and I think we now know also provides important health benefits as well. So that's really where we were, I think, for about a 20-year period. But things changed, and I think that sort of a seminal event was the release in 1992 of the American Heart Association's Statement on Exercise, which for the first time, and I think some of us thought this could have happened sooner than it actually did, but in any case, in 1992, AHA declared that inactivity is recognized as a risk factor for coronary artery disease, and that was an enormously impactful activity. It was followed by a strategic planning process that the American Heart Association undertook that made a bunch of recommendations, many of which have in the interim been acted upon. And but if you look back at that statement on exercise that was published in Circulation, and you look for a specific physical activity guideline or recommendation, I don't think you'll be able to find it. I don't think it's in there. So that statement really is based on the evidence, the research that shows physical activity to be an important factor in reduction of risk for coronary artery disease, but that paper statement did not point to a specific recommendation on types and amounts of physical activity that would be needed for that purpose. And of course, the fact that the American Heart Association made the statement and a lot of other things happened afterwards probably can be traced back to the work of Ralph Paffenbarger in this country and Jerry Morris in the UK, who were really the grandfathers of physical activity epidemiology. Paff in this country studying longshoremen and on the West Coast, and then Harvard alumni applying traditional epidemiologic research methods to the study of physical activity as an exposure with coronary heart disease deaths as the outcome. And of course, that work showed that that in occupational settings, persons with the more sedentary occupations were at substantially greater risk than employees who had physically demanding jobs. Paffenbarger showed it in longshoremen, showed it in largely upper socioeconomic status alumni of Harvard College, and Jerry Morris showed it in London bus drivers and conductors and a number of other occupational groups in the UK. And I think the accumulation of evidence from the field of physical activity epidemiology that Paffenbarger and Morris launched really is the reason that the American Heart Association made its statement on exercise. Not that the work done in exercise physiology up to that point didn't support it, because I think it did. But I'm not sure that in the absence of the epidemiologic data that Paffenbarger, Morris, and the folks that they trained or drew into the field of physical activity epidemiology, I think in the absence of that work, I'm not sure we'd be where we are today with physical activity guidelines. What that evidence showed, I think, is that there are very important health benefits in terms of chronic disease outcomes associated with maintenance of higher physical activity lifestyle. I think that work also shows that the indices of physical activity that predicted those outcomes and documented lower levels of physical activity as a risk factor for chronic disease outcomes really are based on a compilation of many different types of physical activity, and that it was pretty clear that moderate intensity physical activity was part of these indices, and that activity performed in relatively short time increments also contributed to these indices. And so where I think that got us by the early 1990s was the American Heart Association said this is a really important behavior. We had a set of physical activity recommendations that really seemed to emphasize structured, vigorous exercise, but we have these findings from the physical activity epidemiology field that suggest that it probably didn't have to be structured, vigorous exercise in order to derive the benefits. And this inconsistency, I think, initiated a process that has resulted in a different approach to physical activity guidelines that has prevailed ever since that time in the early to mid-90s. So at about that time, with the initiation of the CDC, which approached the American College of Sports Medicine, the process was started. A small group of people that I was a part of came together to initiate a process that was aimed at developing a physical activity guideline that could be seen as a public health recommendation. And so a group was impaneled, brought together for a 2 or 3 day meeting in Atlanta. And as I think back on that experience, I think the mindset of the group that was in the room there working on this guideline was that accumulated and moderate intensity physical activity provides important health benefits. At least that was our interpretation of the physical activity epidemiology literature that had accumulated at that point. We knew from the public health surveillance systems that only 10% of the adult population was meeting the existing standard at that point, which was really the exercise prescription approach, and that there was at least a sense that being perceived as recommending only structured, vigorous exercise might well be a barrier to promoting physical activity in a public health manner. And further, there was the sense from examining the data drawn from the physical activity epidemiology literature that the greatest public health gain might well be associated with avoidance of being in the lowest end of the physical activity continuum. That the biggest bang conceptually would be associated with moving people from sedentary to at least moderately active. And there would be much more public health benefit to that than moving people from somewhat active to highly active, not that there wouldn't be some benefit associated with that. And so I think these were some of the points that people were focused on at that time. But if you're sitting there thinking, well, what we've really got to do is have a physical activity guideline that will be seen as relevant and attainable by people who are today not doing very much physical activity, that would shape how you how you wanted to present this guideline. Well, what resulted from that process was the CDC ACSM physical activity public health recommendation, which is stated here, and every U.S. adult should accumulate 30 minutes or more of moderate intensity physical activity on most, preferably all days of the week. And I can tell you, having been there, that deciding on the core content of that recommendation really was not that complicated or controversial. I think most of the people, or about 20, 25 people in the room, agreed on that core content pretty quickly. Where we spent a lot of time was trying to figure out how to phrase that, and hopefully in a way that would be understandable and clear to the average person, because we really were thinking that this was going to be a public health guideline that would be broadly disseminated to the population at large. And so I'll leave it to others to decide whether we got it right or not, but that was the intention. And so the goal really was to come up with a very simple, straightforward statement, and that was it. Now, if you go back and look at that JAMA article from 1995, you will see that, and if you read far enough down, you'll see that there was a second recommendation, and it was that we encouraged people, regardless of where they were on the activity continuum, to do more, and made the point that there would be benefits associated with that. But from a public communication standpoint, that never got out. What got out was what's right there. And clearly, when it was released, the key issues that people reacted to was the emphasis on moderate intensity physical activity, and on the idea that the activity could be accumulated in bouts of activity that were as short as 10 minutes. And I think that what struck a lot of people was that emphasizing those points seemed inconsistent with the earlier guideline that had been so thoroughly inculcated in the minds of a lot of people. And so I think a lot of people had essentially learned that, it had probably better be continuous. It's probably important that it be fairly vigorous, and then this guideline came along and seemed to be inconsistent with that. And so, some people questioned it. Some people were pretty intense about challenging it. But I think this approach has pretty clearly stood the test of time since the early to mid-1990s. And it was tested quickly. Within a year after the release of the CDC ACSM recommendation, there was an NIH consensus conference that produced a statement. This was an entirely independent, non-overlapping group of people. And I don't mind telling you that a few of us were a little nervous about what was going to come out of this NIH consensus conference, but the guideline that came from that process was essentially the same. It was interesting that it said children and adults, because the CDC guideline really didn't refer to children, and I'm going to have more to say later about guidelines for kids. But this one said children and adults alike should meet a goal of accumulating at least 30 minutes of moderate intensity physical activity. So this NIH consensus conference essentially ratified the CDC ACSM recommendation. That was followed a year or so later by the Surgeon General's report on physical activity and health, which did have a lot, the leadership of that group did have a lot of overlap with the group that had developed the CDC ACSM recommendation. Steve Blair was the senior scientific editor. Bill Haskell was very centrally involved in development of the Surgeon General's report, and as were others who had been very involved in the development of the CDC ACSM recommendation. Though the phrasing is a little different, the recommendation in the Surgeon General's report was essentially the same as the CDC ACSM recommendation. And that's where it sat for about a decade or so. And then in preparation for the release of the 2005 dietary guidelines for Americans, and I'm going to assume that most on the call are aware that for 20 years or more, the federal government at that point had been developing on a 5-year revision cycle, and as mandated by congressional law, updated sets of dietary guidelines. And some of the earlier guidelines had said a little bit about physical activity, but had not gone into it in much depth. And but in preparation for the 2005 dietary guidelines, there was a clear intention to include comment on physical activity and a recommendation on it, particularly in the context of guidelines for weight maintenance. And so, as Tom mentioned in his introduction, I did have the opportunity to serve on the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee in preparation for the release of the 2005 dietary guidelines. And those guidelines did include this recommendation to reduce the risk of chronic disease in adulthood, engage in at least 30 minutes of moderate intensity physical activity. So that pre-existing guideline from the CDC ACSM recommendation was essentially incorporated into the dietary guidelines, and in the so-called energy balance section of the dietary guidelines, which are really aimed at issues related to weight maintenance and avoidance of obesity. It was also acknowledged in that dietary guidelines that more than the 30 minutes may well be required for avoidance of excessive weight gain, and so this statement was included to help manage body weight, prevent gradual unhealthy weight gain in adulthood, engage in approximately 60 minutes, and I think we do know that that's variable across individuals, but I think the intent was to make the point that 30 minutes per day may do it for a lot of people, but it may not be enough, particularly in a society where kind of our baseline levels of light activity are low and going lower. Many people may need more than 30 minutes per day to avoid excessive weight gain. Well, at that point, an interesting thing had happened, and I'm not sure that it was necessarily fully thought out, but it was that for the first time, in the context of the dietary guidelines, the federal government had said something official about physical activity guidelines. And it didn't strike everybody as entirely wonderful that the federal guideline on physical activity was embedded in the dietary guidelines. And so that really, I think, was instrumental in kicking off a process that resulted in the development and ultimately the release of the 2008 physical activity guidelines, which I think was a huge and seminal step for our field. And before I forget to say it, let me mention that the physical activity guidelines for Americans released in 2008 did not result from federal legislation in Congress, as had been the case with the dietary guidelines. The 2008 physical activity guidelines for Americans occurred because then Secretary of Health and Human Services Mike Leavitt, this was in the last couple of years of the Bush administration, Leavitt decided that it ought to happen. And he made the funding available from his budget to support the work that that resulted in the development of the guidelines. And today there is still no congressional mandate that the physical activity guidelines will be updated, though I think the Department of Health and Human Services does have that intention. There is an advocacy effort underway with Congress to support legislation to mandate the development of physical activity guidelines on a regular revision cycle, but that legislation hasn't been passed yet. So if you have an interest in calling your congressperson, I would encourage you to do that, because at this point there's not certainty that the physical activity guidelines will be updated on a regular basis. The background at that time then was that we'd had the dietary guidelines since 1980, but the federal government really had never produced comprehensive physical activity guidelines, so what that really highlighted was the fact that the Surgeon General's report that had been developed a decade or so before produced a major review of the science, but it hadn't been done since then, and so there was a perceived need that, or at least a sense that it might be necessary and appropriate to revisit that science and, in a sense, establish for the first time freestanding, detailed federal guidelines on physical activity. So what was kicked off was a process that essentially mimicked the process that's used with the dietary guidelines, and that is to begin with an Institute of Medicine report, which then, if the decision is that there's a scientific rationale for producing guidelines, then a scientific advisory panel is appointed, which overviews the scientific literature and summarizes it. That information is then passed to the federal agency involved, in this case the Department of Health and Human Services, which then develops the guidelines that are subsequently disseminated. So the question that was then posed in an Institute of Medicine report was, is there sufficient scientific evidence upon which to base physical activity guidelines for Americans? And this issue was addressed in a workshop that was undertaken in 2006 in Washington, D.C., a two-day meeting. A lot of people made presentations, and then a group sort of reviewed it all and summarized it and made a recommendation to the Department of Health and Human Services that basically made this conclusion, that the evidence presented at that workshop clearly indicates that there's a large volume of high-quality data, much of it recent, that could inform new physical activity guidelines. And so based on that recommendation, the decision was made to go forward. with the creation of a Physical Activity Guidelines Advisory Committee, analogous to the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee that does the same thing on the diet side every 5 years. And I was honored to be a part of that group. This is the list of people who served on the Physical Activity Guidelines Advisory Committee, and there'll be, for those on the call, some pretty familiar names there. People clearly from our field: Bill Haskell and Ed Hawley and Rod Dishman and others who are clearly very embedded in our discipline. The committee organized its work around these issues, and so you can see there was a sort of a health outcome organizational scheme here for the most part, except for a subgroup that I was a part of that focused on youth, and another that focused on underserved populations. But you can see that much of the work was focused on reviewing the literature on the relationship between physical activity and a range of health outcomes, from all-cause mortality to mental health, and then some special population focus was included. That work went on pretty intense for about a year and produced a very detailed report from the committee that was passed along to the Department of Health and Human Services. And among the conclusions in that report was that there was strong evidence in adults and older adults for lower risk associated with higher levels of physical activity of early death, heart disease, stroke, type 2 diabetes, on and on. You can see the list there, but it's a pretty substantial list where the indication was that there was strong evidence of a health benefit associated with higher levels of physical activity. At that time, the judgment was that there was moderate to strong evidence for better functional health in older adults and reduced abdominal obesity, and moderate evidence for weight maintenance after weight loss, lower risk of hip fracture, and some others. For children and adolescents, part of the report that I was most involved with working on, we concluded that there was strong evidence for higher levels of cardiorespiratory endurance and muscular fitness with higher levels of activity, more favorable body composition, improved bone health, and improved cardiovascular and metabolic health biomarkers, moderate evidence for reduced symptoms of mental health outcomes, anxiety, and depression. In October of 2008, the guidelines themselves were finalized and released, and the statement here from Secretary Leavitt that the evidence is clear. Regular physical activity over months and years produces long-term health benefits and reduces the risk of many diseases. The more physically active you are, the more health benefits you gain. And you know, that statement is probably not something that would be any surprise to this group, but I think the fact that it was made by the Secretary of Health and Human Services in the U.S. government, and that it was made in the context of releasing the first federal comprehensive physical activity guidelines on physical activity does make it pretty important step for our field, and one that had not been taken before. And frankly, one reason why I think this is important is the vetting process that a document like this has to go through. Every federal agency reviews them and comments on them, and they take it seriously. So if something makes it through that process, it's I think seen as substantive. And so the guideline was very consistent with earlier public health guidelines on physical activity, phrased again a little differently. 2.5 hours per week of moderate intensity physical activity, so that's about the same as 30 minutes, 5 days a week. But the core recommendation did acknowledge more clearly than had been done before that if the activity was vigorous, that less time was required to provide an equivalent benefit. So the idea was think of it as sort of a sliding scale between all the activity is moderate, all the activity is vigorous. There's sort of a time adjustment there based on how intense the activity is. Once again, there was an endorsement of the idea that the bouts of activity should be at least 10 minutes in duration. I personally challenge that one, but the science right now probably doesn't allow presenting it otherwise. Additional health benefits are there with more time investment, and then also really for the first time, I think muscle strengthening activity got up into the headlines. The guideline for kids is one that was consistent with some earlier physical activity guidelines for children and adolescents that had come from other sources, and it was that an hour or more of at least moderate intensity physical activity per day was recommended, and that within that hour kids should regularly engage in moderate to vigorous intensity aerobic activity, that vigorous intensity activity should be included at least 3 days a week, and that muscle strengthening and bone loading activity also should be included 3 days a week. So to summarize that, hour a day of moderate to vigorous activity, and within that hour a day, regular participation in vigorous activity as well as muscle strengthening and bone loading activity. So the guidelines were released in 2008, and I think that kind of brings us to essentially where we are today, with one exception, and that is that physical activity guidelines up through the 2008 federal guidelines had left out children younger than traditional school age. So younger than 6, there really hasn't been a formal, widely accepted evidence-based guideline. But that really has, I think, in a way changed in in the intervening few years, and as a result of, I think, a lot of added research activity regarding this issue. And so some time ago, NASP, as this group knows, a subgroup of one of the associations of AFERD, had issued guidelines on physical activity for toddlers and preschoolers. And there were 2 guidelines. One is that young children should accumulate at least 30 minutes of structured physical activity, preschoolers at least 60 minutes, and then also additional time recommended for unstructured physical activity, and indication that kids should not be sedentary for more than 60 minutes at a time except when sleeping. So that NASP guideline, which got out there some time ago and was updated a few years after that, was sort of probably the approach that was most widely disseminated, but in all honesty, I think probably not as evidence-based as might be ideal. And so this has been revisited a few times now in the last 2-3 years, and I think some consensus has emerged in the last year or two. In an Institute of Medicine report that, again, I'll have to acknowledge I was a part of, a guideline was included for physical activity for young children, 3 to 5-year-olds, and it's phrased as that child care providers should provide opportunities for light, moderate, and vigorous physical activity for at least 15 minutes per hour. Well, if you think of young kids as awake for maybe 12 hours a day, that corresponds to about 3 hours of total physical activity. And I think it's important to note that there was a clear intention here to include all physical activity, including light, as well as moderate and vigorous. And I think there's probably a fairly rapidly developing sense that the traditional moderate to vigorous physical activity concept that's pretty well grounded for older kids and adults may not apply that terribly well to younger kids, preschoolers. And And so, with the advent of accelerometry as an objective measure of physical activity, it's possible to look at these things pretty clearly in young kids. And so this guideline from the IOM, is phrased as 15 minutes per hour of sort of exposure to whatever the setting is, but it adds up to essentially 3 hours of total physical activity per day, including anything from light through moderate to vigorous intensity activity. Well, interestingly enough, at about the same time the IOM report was being developed, and totally independently, guidelines were being developed and ultimately released in the UK, Australia, and Canada, all of which, though phrased a little differently, said essentially the same thing, which is that preschoolers should be physically active daily for at least 180 minutes spread throughout the day. Australia, Canada phrased it a little differently, but essentially the same guidelines. So I think where we are is that there is an emerging consensus about recommended activity levels for young children. In our data, the 15 minutes per hour adding up to about 180 minutes per day is around the median for what you see in 3 to 5-year-olds, and so in a sense the guideline has been set at kind of the median for kids this age, and I guess the sort of the implied recommendation is that we ought to get kids who are below that median up toward the median, and what clearly is needed is more health outcome research in this young age group, but of course you are limited because kids this age don't manifest the negative health outcomes that you can see in older kids and adults and older adults. So to summarize, where I think we are right now is that there's good consensus. It's really held up since the early 1990s that adults ought to be getting 30 minutes or more of moderate intensity physical activity. If the activity is vigorous, then the duration can be less than that. That should be 6 to 18 years, not 16 to 18. For 6 to 18-year-old kids, the guideline, again, widely accepted around the world, is 60 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity per day. And then the emerging consensus seems to be that 3 to 5-year-olds should be getting about 3 hours of total physical activity per day, including light, moderate, and vigorous. So with that, I'll be very happy to respond to any questions that Tom may want to pose to me. And I very much appreciate everyone's attention.
Okay. Since I'm totally incompetent in this technology, I am hard-pressed to see questions that came up on the screen, so I might ask for some assistance from our organizers from HK. But I would like to pose one question as a faculty member in sport pedagogy, someone who trains teachers. Russ, what's your read on the dissemination of this literature to our schools, to teachers of physical education or other people involved in physical activity for kids?
Yeah.
This is a concern, and I think I'm not sure that level of dissemination is what we should have.
Yeah, Tom, thank you for that question. It's an issue that I do care about a lot, and I think we can do better. I think we should do better. I think our field would benefit from placing greater emphasis on what we know about the important public health benefits of physical activity, and I've written about this with some frequency over the years, but I really think it's very important for for professionals in our field, broadly defined, and certainly to include teachers of physical education in our schools, to be well acquainted with with these public health applications of the science that's been done in this field. And I personally think that that it is possible to to blend some of the traditional emphasis of the field of physical education on motor skills and organized sport activities and so on, with the public health goal of providing kids with the physical activity they need as kids, and promotion of physical activity as a lifelong behavior. So I personally think we can put that all together, and I think we know that some teachers out there are doing that. I think we also know that a lot of teachers out there are not doing it right now, and I think there would be a huge benefit to our doing a better job of preparing our our students to apply this knowledge.
Yeah, I appreciate your response. Clearly, on one level, at the school level, we're talking about trying to influence teachers. On a larger level, we're trying to, I think, influence policymakers that readily understand what these guidelines are all about, and trying to transfer those guidelines into some meaty policies that then can filter down to the schools. And it's rather frustrating, and it's a very complex issue, I know, but I certainly appreciate all your efforts to try to influence the activity levels of kids and adults, that's for sure.
Well, Tom, I'll give an example of sort of the way I view the world, I guess, here. And so, if you're thinking about kids and whether or not they're getting the 60 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity per day that the guideline calls for, and then you think about kids coming to physical education class, and the kids walk in the gym, and then you ask yourself, okay, when they're coming through that door into the gym, what's happening? And I guess the way I view the world is, any time they're spending in that environment when they're not moving is wasted time. And that doesn't mean that I think we should turn physical education into just boot camp, or that there isn't an important place for the other kinds of instruction that can and ought to happen in a physical education class. But I got to tell you, if I see kids walk in a gym and stand on the line for 10 minutes before anything happens, I see that as just an unacceptable waste of time, when those kids could be engaged in enjoyable, useful physical activity.
Absolutely. I don't think anyone would disagree with that position, that's for sure.
Okay, we do have some questions now. Russ, could you please comment on the relationship between the physical activity guidelines and the National Physical Activity Plan?
Well, I'd be excited to do it. Whoever asked the question, I appreciate bringing it up. The National Physical Activity Plan, which is a comprehensive strategic plan for changes that we should make in our communities to increase the probability that people will be able to meet physical activity guidelines. That plan was spawned by thinking that emerged from the development of the physical activity guidelines themselves. And since I was involved, I can tell you the story. And I think the work was being finalized at CDC, preparing for the release of the physical activity guidelines, and this was in 2007 in anticipation for the release of the guidelines in 2008. And folks there thought, well, there's really a need for a companion undertaking, because what the guidelines do is lay out in considerable detail the types and amounts of physical activity that we think people should do to derive health benefits. But the guidelines themselves don't say very much about what we as a society need to do to help people meet those guidelines. And so the national plan really emerged from the work on the guidelines and was intended to be, in a sense, a companion to the guidelines. And so I think of the National Physical Activity Plan. If you're not familiar with it, I encourage you to go to physicalactivityplan.org and take a look at it. But essentially, it's a set of strategies and tactics that were the result of really a two and a half year process where a lot of people considered the evidence and made recommendations in 8 societal sectors, indicating things that we should do in each of those sectors to support people attaining the physical activity guidelines. So I appreciate the opportunity to sort of bring attention to the National Physical Activity Plan.
Okay, another question. You mentioned that you fought against the specification that physical activity should be at least 10 minutes duration in the 2008 guidelines. Can you talk about why you felt that way and why others insisted on having that in? How do you think that having that 10-minute rule has influenced people being physically active, if at all?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, I don't know the answer to the last part. I wish I did, but I can tell you what I think, and it is, and you know, I was there when, you know, the discussions took place that resulted in that sort of 10-minute bout caveat being included in the guideline. I personally think that if you look at the physical activity epidemiology literature alone, you would be hard-pressed to conclude that the activity has to be performed in 10-minute increments. You know, how long does it take to climb a flight of stairs? Not that long, right? 30 seconds. But if you look at the Paffenbarger Physical Activity Index, that's one component of it. And if you look at the other approaches to measuring physical activity that have been used in large epidemiologic studies, you know, I think what you see contributing to those indices really is all kinds of accumulated moderate to vigorous physical activity. And so I don't think you could, working only from the epidemiologic literature, come to the conclusion that the activity has to be performed in 10-minute bouts. But there was a strong sense, and I think it continues, that there should be physiologic backup to the conclusions that are drawn from the epidemiologic literature. And so then that takes you to the controlled exercise training studies and to the literature in which there's a very controlled approach to the exercise and an indication of you know, the health outcomes associated with that, you know, that controlled exercise. And that's where you know, the bouts that have been studied, about the shortest bouts that have been studied are 10-minute bouts. And at that time, and if you go back to that 95 JAMA article, I think we cited 2 or at most 3 articles to support that 10-minute bout caveat, and one of them was in the Japanese literature that we had to get somebody to interpret for us. And I don't think there's a lot more now, but you know, personally, I don't think bouts matter, but I do think that the physiologic literature, the controlled exercise training literature is limited, and I hope that those limitations will in time go away. You know, I'd love to see studies done on 31-minute bouts or 60 30-second bouts distributed across the day, but of course trying to figure out how to do those studies is not simple.
Okay, I think we have time for one quick question. Following up on the question about PE teachers, how do schools incorporate the muscle strengthening activities into their programs?
Yeah, good question. And I'll add to it the bone loading activity as well, which I think is really important. Well, I think the answer is include in either the organization of the physical education classes, or of course we've got a growth industry right now in classroom exercise breaks and sort of enriched recess periods and activity periods before school and after school. I think that in any or all of those settings, systematically including activities that provide resistance for the large muscle groups. So I think this can be anything from game or sport activities that involve resistance to the large muscle groups, or for that matter structured calisthenic type exercise, or gymnastic activities and things of that sort that clearly involve controlling and working against significant percentages of the body weight. Would be helpful. And then for the bone loading activity, it's the jumping and landing and the activities that really provide a loading to the skeleton that I think if we plan for it, we can incorporate into these planned physical activity sessions that kids can get in the school environment, PE classes, but including the other opportunities as well.
Well, thank you, Russ. I really appreciate your wonderful presentation today, and certainly for your wonderful contributions over your career, not only on behalf of our discipline, but certainly on behalf of all American adults and children who hopefully will benefit from your splendid contributions. I certainly thank everyone for joining us today, and I ask that you take a few moments when the webinar window closes to complete a short survey on today's webinar. We certainly would appreciate your feedback as it helps us continually improve our webinar series, and please know that there'll be many more webinars planned by AKA in the future. Finally, we will email everyone a link to today's presentation so you can view it yourself, or hopefully pass it along to your friends and colleagues who might not have been able to attend today. So again, thanks to Russ, and thanks to everyone for your participation today, and have a great afternoon.